was that?
26 trapped miners who are running out of air.
Horse. Can you make it happen?
Told you this wasn't gonna be easy.
We've been separated. Now I'm angry. Right together, go!
Cut me loose or you're all going in!
There's no time.
The Ice Road, 2021. What follows are comprehensive analyses and explanations of the entire film. The Ice Road is a 2021 action thriller that attempts to fuse the disaster movie template with the blue-collar grit of a trucking drama. Directed by Jonathan Hensley, the film consciously echoes the existential dread and mechanical tension of Henri-Georges Clouzot's 1953 masterpiece The Wages of Fear. However, Hensley transplants the nitroglycerin payload from a South American jungle to the frozen, cracking expanse of a Canadian ice road, replacing sweating anxiety with a cold, brittle terror. The film's fundamental premise is a race against time, a classic thriller mechanism. A methane explosion traps 26 miners in the Katka diamond mine in Manitoba, and the only way to deliver a rescue wellhead is across melting April ice. The clock is set at 30 hours before the miners suffocate, a numerical limit that is less about realistic physics and more about imposing an unrelenting dramatic pressure that justifies every subsequent reckless decision the characters make. The opening sequence establishes Mike McCann's character not through exposition, but through action and confrontation. We meet him and his brother Gertie in a truck cab, immediately setting the film's primary environment. Mike's violent defense of his brother against a coworker's insult serves a dual narrative purpose. It immediately establishes the ferocity of his brotherly love and efficiently gets them fired, freeing them for the mission that will define the film. Liam Neeson's performance as Mike operates within a very specific cinematic persona he has cultivated since Taken. He plays the archetype of the aging, world-weary working man with a specific, often violent skill set. In The Ice Road, his skill isn't a particular set of skills for killing, but rather the intuition and nerve for operating a massive rig under impossible conditions. This is a physical, grunting performance, one that conveys the immense weight of the truck and the responsibility he carries. The portrayal of Gertie, Mike's brother played by Marcus Thomas, is one of the film's most delicate and crucial elements. Gertie is an Iraq War veteran suffering from PTSD and aphasia, and he is a gifted mechanic. The film immediately establishes him as the emotional anchor and the mission's moral compass. His aphasia, which causes him to struggle with words, is not played for pity, but as a condition that reveals a different form of intelligence, one rooted in machinery and pure feeling. The brothers' catchphrase, TRK, 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 serves as a powerful mnemonic device for the film's emotional core. It's a primal, childlike sound of a diesel engine that Gertie uses to express joy and excitement. This verbal tick, which could be a symptom of his trauma, is instead transformed into a symbol of their unbreakable bond, a secret language that defines their relationship and ultimately becomes the epitaph on Mike's new truck, signifying that Gertie's spirit will forever ride with him. The introduction of Jim Goldenrod, played by Laurence Fishburne, brings a gravitas that immediately elevates the film. Goldenrod is the grizzled veteran, the owner of a failing trucking company, who takes on this suicide mission not just for the money, but from a vague, unspoken sense of professional pride. Fishburne plays him with a weary authority that suggests a lifetime of hard miles, making his sudden, brutal death a shocking severing of the film's experience and stability. Goldenrod's death scene is the film's first major set piece, and its most shocking narrative twist. The deception is brilliant and cruel. The audience, familiar with star billing, assumes Fishburne's character will be a co-lead for the entire journey. When his truck breaks through the ice and he calmly instructs Tantu to cut the strap connecting his rig to hers, it destabilizes our expectations. His sacrifice is a pragmatic martyrdom, a professional driver's final, logical act to save the payload and the mission. The actuary Tom Varney, played with a cold sneer by Benjamin Walker, represents the film's villainous face of corporate greed. Varney is the ultimate white-collar parasite on a blue-collar mission. His presence is initially justified as a company representative assessing the multi-million-dollar risk, but his transition to active saboteur marks the film's shift from a man-versus-nature thriller to a conspiracy chase film. He is the embodiment of the idea that the most dangerous predator on the ice is not the cold, but unchecked capitalism. The film's geography is a character in itself. The Ice Road is a temporary winter highway built on frozen lakes, a lifeline that connects remote northern communities and industries. The film's central dramatic irony is that the mission takes place in April, when the ice is literally rotting. Every foot of progress is a gamble, and the sound design is crucial here, turning the groaning, cracking ice into a predatory voice that seems to be actively hunting the convoy. Amber Midthunder's character, Tantu, is introduced as a young indigenous woman with a personal stake. Her brother Cody is one of the trapped miners. The film does not treat her indigeneity as a gimmick, but as an integral part of her character's competency and perspective. She is a skilled trucker who knows the land and the ice. Her nickname Tantu is a clear and respectful nod to the iconic Cree and Metis actress Tantu Cardinal, a piece of metacasting that grounds the film in a real cultural landscape. The film's treatment of its indigenous characters is a double-edged sword. On one hand, the casting of Amber Midthunder and the presence of a mostly indigenous group of trapped miners is a direct acknowledgement of the real-world demographics of the Canadian resource extraction workforce. On the other hand, the plot essentially treats the miners as a passive, imperiled collective that requires a white savior, a trope that complicates the film's attempts at progressive representation, even with Tantu as an active participant in the rescue. The action choreography on the ice is a mix of practical tension and CGI chaos. The early sequences, where a truck's weight on the ice is a constant mathematical calculation, are genuinely effective. When a rig fishtails on a crack, the scene uses the physics of inertia and mass to create a unique form of automotive terror that is distinct from a car chase on pavement. This is a ballet of weight, where deceleration can be just as deadly as acceleration. The visual effects become a point of contention as the film progresses. While the stark, snow-blasted landscapes of Manitoba provide an authentic, bleak canvas, the computer-generated imagery for the ice cracking and the avalanche sequence feels jarringly artificial. The ice often lacks the translucent, complex physics of real frozen water, looking instead like a flat, blue-white surface that shatters in an unconvincing geometric pattern, breaking the illusion of a documentary-like survival thriller. The introduction of the corporate conspiracy changes the film's engine. Once Varney reveals his hand, murdering the geologist and sabotaging the trucks, the threat moves from an impersonal, environmental force to a personal, human one. This is a necessary structural shift for an action movie, but it dilutes the unique premise. The film begins as a battle against the sublime indifference of nature and devolves into a standard fight against a mustache-twirling villain. The fight scene in the moving trailer is a masterclass in confined action geography. Mike and Varney brawl in a space cluttered with tools and equipment, a rolling, unstable arena. The scene understands that in a trucker movie, the rig is not just a vehicle but a home, a workshop, and a weapon. The violence is clumsy, desperate, and heavy, a departure from Neeson's more precision-based combat roles into the frantic scrapping of a man who is out of his element, but not out of his depth. The film's most absurd yet strangely compelling action sequence is the avalanche scene. After a maniacal Varney shoots at the ice wall to trigger a slide, the truck is hit by a CGI cascade of snow. The physics are entirely fantastical. A truck outrunning an avalanche on a tight, icy road is a ludicrous concept, but it leans so hard into its own ridiculousness that it crosses into a kind of B-movie spectacle. It's a moment where the film pivots from a tense thriller to a live-action cartoon. The bridge crossing sequence is where the film reclaims its tragic thriller status. This is a classic Wages of Fear moment, a series of terrifying, slow-motion maneuvers on a rickety, condemned bridge over a raging river. The sequence is a series of agonizing choices, each inch forward threatening a complete collapse. The strain on the winch cable, the groaning of the wooden beams, and the sheer drop below combine to create the film's purest moment of vertiginous dread. Gertie's death on the bridge is the film's emotional high point and its most sincere narrative beat. His final act is not one of intellectual strategy, but of pure instinct and love. When the truck begins to slide, he uses his own body as a chock, a human wedge against mechanical failure, to buy his brother a few more seconds. Marcus Thomas's performance in this moment, where his garbled words, I'm okay, become a devastating prayer of denial, is the one time the film achieves true pathos. The cold water paradox is a glaring technical flaw. When characters plunge into the freezing water of the Canadian winter, they emerge and continue to function. In reality, hypothermic shock would incapacitate them in minutes. The film treats an icy bath as an inconvenience rather than an immediate, lethal emergency. This lack of physiological consequence is one of the main reasons the film struggles to maintain a sense of genuine, grounded danger in its second half. The film's use of heavy machinery as a weapon is a defining feature. Winches, chains, and the trucks themselves are used in combat. When Mike crushes Sickle with a forklift-like mechanism, it's a moment of poetic, mechanical justice. The corporate stooge is killed by the very tools of the trade he exploited. This kinetic language speaks to the film's core belief. The working class will ultimately be the instrument of its own justice, using the machines they know better than anyone. The relationship between Mike and Tantu is thankfully not a romantic one. Instead, it is a bond forged in mutual trauma, respect, and survival. Tantu's competence is never questioned because of her gender. She is the best driver next to Goldenrod, and her knowledge of the terrain is critical. She suffers the film's brutal physicality, getting knocked out, frozen, and battered, and she gets back up each time, a testament to her resilience without the narrative needing to explicitly comment on it. The film's soundscape is an often underappreciated element. The diesel engines have a percussive, grinding quality that becomes the film's heartbeat. The silence of the frozen lake is punctuated by the haunting, whale song-like moans of the ice sheet under stress. Max Ehren's score blends these industrial sounds with a throbbing orchestral score that, while sometimes overly bombastic, successfully mimics the grinding tension of the truck's engines and the ticking clock. The film is a study in what constitutes blue-collar cinema. Every character's value is defined by their practical skill. Mike's violent temper is a liability, but his intuition is an asset. Gertie's aphasia is a social barrier, but his mechanical genius is a gift. Tantu's personal loyalty is her strength. The corporate villain, by contrast, has no tangible skill beyond manipulation. And this is what marks him for death in the moral economy of this world, where a person's worth is measured by what they can build or fix with their hands. The movie's color palette is deliberately desaturated, a world of whites, grays, and the dull orange of safety equipment. This visual monotony serves a thematic purpose. It erases the world outside the mission. There is no green, no warmth, no life. The only vibrant color is red, the blood of the characters and the taillights of the trucks disappearing into the storm, creating a visual motif of life and danger in a barren, monochromatic world. The revelation of the mind's condition is the film's final, cynical punchline. After all the death and sacrifice, the The miners are found in a state of chaotic panic, fighting each other. The mine's methane sensors were deliberately covered, a clear indictment of the real-world practices of some resource companies that prioritize production quotas over safety protocols. The trapped miners are not just victims of an accident. They are victims of a deliberate policy of neglect. The film's editing rhythm is fast and a bit disjointed, especially in the action scenes. There are moments where the spatial geography of a fight or a crash is muddled by quick cuts, a common affliction in modern action cinema that seeks to generate excitement through a flurry of images rather than a clear choreographic cause and effect. This style clashes with the more methodical, tension-based filmmaking that the Ice Road premise naturally demands. The denouement, showing Tantu working in the garage and Mike visiting in a new gold truck, is an unusually subdued and melancholic ending for the genre. There's no big romantic kiss, no cheering crowd. It's just two survivors, connected by a shared, silent understanding of loss. The license plate, TRK, 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 is the film's final line, a silent visual eulogy that is far more effective than any spoken dialogue could have been, suggesting that in the end, we are all just making noise to keep the memory alive. The sequel hook is entirely absent within the film's text, but was born from its commercial success. The Ice Road functions as a complete, closed story, ending in tragedy and a quiet rebirth. The decision to make Ice Road 2, Road to the Sky, sending Mike McCann to Nepal, is an act of commercial franchising that retroactively changes how one views the original. Not as a standalone tragedy, but as an origin story for a globe-trotting trucker hero, a concept that is both absurd and brilliantly pulpy. The film's use of aphasia as a narrative device is a high-risk, high-reward choice. At times, Gertie's condition is used for cheap tension, like when he cannot verbalize a warning quickly enough. At other times, it's a profound window into nonverbal communication. The moment he correctly identifies a mechanical problem by sound alone, for example, is a quiet celebration of a mind that works differently, one that is fully capable, just not in the way the neurotypical world demands. The politics of labor are at the forefront. The union is mocked, the workers are disposable, and the management is evil. This is a deeply cynical, almost pre-unionized view of the world, where protection comes not from a collective bargaining agreement, but from the personal loyalty between a few good men and women. Jim Goldenrod is a failed company owner, a man caught between the corporate powers that hire him and the workers he cannot fully protect. His death is the death of a middleman, a class that has no place in this cutthroat world. The film's title is a promise it only partially keeps. The Ice Road promises a specific location-bound thriller, but after Goldenrod's death and the first ice crack, the road element becomes less prominent. The second half is a more generic chase through snowy woods and mountains. It breaks the central covenant of the high-concept pitch, which is one of the reasons for the critical frustration. The film seems to abandon its most distinctive element halfway through. The film's climactic confrontation is an inversion of the traditional shootout. The final duel is not between Mike and Varney, but a complex mechanical puzzle involving a truck, a bomb, and a winch. Mike's victory is not achieved with a gun, which he barely uses, but with his trucker's knowledge. He outrigs the villain. It's a clever way to stay true to the character's identity, turning the action hero into a problem solver rather than a simple executioner. The film's depiction of PTSD is woven into the fabric of its protagonist's journey. Mike is not a diagnosed veteran, but his violent outbursts, his restlessness, and his singular, obsessive focus on saving his brother all point to a form of trauma. The film suggests, without ever stating outright, that the two brothers are bound by different forms of trauma from different wars, one from Iraq and one from the economic and emotional wasteland of their lives. The scene where Mike punches a man for mocking Gertie is a brilliant bit of audience manipulation. In a more polite film, Mike's violence would be a last resort. Here, it's a preemptive, satisfying strike. It tells us this is a world where social niceties have frozen over. Might makes right, and the defense of the vulnerable is an immediate physical duty. It establishes the film's moral code. Pacifism in the face of cruelty is not a virtue. The logistics of the mission are astoundingly purposefully insane. Transporting 30-ton wellheads across melting ice is a plan born of desperation, and the film knows it. The actuary's calculation that the risk is financially justified is the film's central horror. A human life has a dollar value, and the potential payout from a lawsuit is weighed against the cost of a dangerous rescue. This is the chilling, logical heart of the corporate malfeasance theme. The brotherly dynamic between Mike and Gertie is the only intimate relationship in the film, and it subverts the typical action movie family trope. Gertie is not a damsel in distress to be saved, but a partner to be understood. Their communication is a series of half-sentences, grunts, and jokes. This shorthand is a testament to Neeson and Thomas's chemistry. They feel like brothers not because of melodramatic declarations, but because of the way they silently share a candy bar. The film's violence is blunt and unstylized. When the geologist has his head smashed in, it's ugly and abrupt. When bodies are crushed, the sound is a sickening crunch rather than a heroic thwack. This aesthetic choice is important. It divorces the film from the balletic violence of something like John Wick. Violence here is a consequence of weight, metal, and the cold, hard ground. It's a working-class violence, not an aristocratic one. The character of Sickle, the mine manager, is a classic middle management weasel. He is not the mastermind, but the gleeful executor of cruel policies. His comeuppance, being arrested for his crimes, is a rare moment of institutional justice in a film that otherwise operates entirely outside the law. The police do not exist on the ice road. Justice is a personal, violent affair until the corporate veil is lifted and the system is finally forced to intervene. The melting ice is a palpable metaphor for the film's economic anxieties. The road that supports these communities is literally disappearing due to climate change, a fact the film mentions but doesn't belabor. The desperation of the mission is a product of a warming world, making this a disaster film that has a quiet, almost subliminal, ecological message buried under the screeching tires and explosive set pieces. The film's humor is dark and infrequent, mostly arising from Gertie's unfiltered observations. His naming of the truck, his direct statements in the middle of tense moments, provide the only moments of levity. This humor is not a relief, but a poignant reminder of his innocence within a corrupt system. When he is gone, the film becomes tonally bleak, robbed of its only source of untainted optimism. The map and the clock are constant visual motifs. Hensley regularly cuts to the GPS display, or a watch, a vestigial technique from 1990s thrillers. This constant timestamping is a double-edged sword. It maintains a strict sense of urgency, but it also becomes slightly comical as the physical feats required to meet the deadline become increasingly superhuman. The clock eventually stops being a measure of realism and becomes a pure dramatic device. The industrial setting of the mine at the end feels like a descent into the underworld. After the blinding white of the ice, the mine is a claustrophobic, dark, red-lit inferno. This visual shift signals the final battle, moving from an open-air natural threat to a closed-in, man-made hell. The corporate villain is finally cornered not in the pristine wilderness, but in the filthy, dangerous reality of the mine his company has neglected. The film's ending answers the question of whether the sacrifice was worth it with a resounding yes, but not without a cost. The miners are saved, the company is exposed, and two broken individuals, Mike and Tantu, are left to pick up the pieces. It's a Pyrrhic victory. Mike has lost his brother, the one person he was sworn to protect, making his heroism a personal failure even as it is a public success. The movie is a fascinating artifact of the COVID-era streaming boom. Released directly to Netflix, it was designed for an audience seeking a solid, unpretentious Saturday night watch. Its lack of theatrical spectacle is its greatest weakness, but its availability and the comfort of its familiar, formulaic beats are arguably why it found a massive streaming audience that was more forgiving than the critical establishment. Tantu's character arc is one of quiet empowerment. She begins as an apprentice, almost an observer, hesitant and driven by fear for her brother. By the end, she is a full partner, a first-rate trucker who has survived the same trials as Mike. Her taking over Goldenrod's shop is not just an economic transaction. It's a passing of the torch, a suggestion that the future of this blue-collar world is female and indigenous. The film's central thesis on heroism is a simple, classical one. A hero is someone who takes responsibility. Mike doesn't want to be a hero. He wants a paycheck. Goldenrod doesn't want a glorious death. He just wants the mission to succeed. Varney, who seeks power and control, is the only one who actively pursues a form of glory, and he is the villain. Heroism is framed as a burden, not an aspiration. The film's aesthetic can be described as functional Gothic. The trucks are hulking, monstrous shapes in the mist. The ice is a fragile, glass floor over a black abyss. The setting is not beautiful, but sublime in its capacity to annihilate. This visual language taps into a primal fear of nature's power, a fear that the film's human villains attempt, and ultimately fail, to exploit for their own gain. Ultimately, The Ice Road is a film about the weight of a promise. Mike promised to protect his brother, a promise he ultimately cannot keep. The truckers promise to deliver the wellhead, a promise they fulfill at a ruinous cost. The mining company breaks its promise of safety, and this broken promise is the original sin that sets the entire tragedy in motion. In the film's moral universe, a broken promise has a physical weight, heavy enough to crack the ice and swallow a man whole. The Ice Road establishes its temporal and physical setting with an almost documentary-like economy in its opening minutes. A title card informs us we are in Manitoba, Canada, in early April, a period when the winter roads that serve as lifelines to remote northern mining operations are legally closing. The ice, which in February can support over 40,000 kilograms of rolling weight, is now decaying, its crystalline structure weakening from the relentless spring thaw. This specific seasonal moment is not arbitrary window dressing, but the film's central dramatic engine, transforming the landscape itself into a ticking time bomb that must be crossed before it literally liquefies beneath the characters' wheels. The film asks its audience to accept that the most dangerous antagonist is not a person but a temperature, a thermodynamic inevitability that no amount of courage can negotiate with or intimidate into submission. The casting of Liam Neeson in the lead role carries a weight of cinematic history that the film consciously leverages and subtly subverts. Since his career reinvention as an action star beginning in 2008, Neeson has portrayed a series of men with lethal competencies, former operatives and law enforcement officers who navigate worlds of espionage and organized crime with professional precision. Mike McCann, however, is not a man of violence by trade, but a long-haul trucker whose physicality is born not from tactical training, but from decades of loading cargo, wrestling with frozen tarpaulins, and manhandling 18-speed transmissions in sub-zero conditions. Neeson's weathered face and gravelly voice suggest a life of hard labor rather than covert operations, grounding the character in a distinctly blue-collar authenticity that distinguishes this performance from his more glamorous action roles. The film's visual strategy relies heavily on the concept of negative space, using the vast white expanses of the frozen landscape to create a sense of isolation that borders on the existential. Cinematographer Tom Stern, a longtime Clint Eastwood collaborator known for his mastery of shadow and contrast, applies his high-contrast aesthetic to a world of blinding whites and crushing blacks. The convoy of trucks is frequently framed from extreme wide angles that reduce these massive machines to specks crawling across an indifferent void, a visual metaphor for human fragility that operates independently of dialogue or plot. This deliberate compositional choice transforms the setting from a mere backdrop into an active narrative participant, a silent character whose judgment is final and whose mercy is non-existent. The sound design deserves extensive analysis as a crucial element that the film's critical reception largely overlooked. The auditory world of The Ice Road is constructed from industrial textures, the percussive clatter of diesel engines, the metallic groan of stressed trailer hitches, and the constant whisper of wind across frozen surfaces. More importantly, the ice itself is given a voice, a deep, resonant cracking that sounds less like breaking glass and more like the groan of a living creature shifting in uneasy sleep. This sonic characterization of the environment creates a persistent undercurrent of dread that operates on a subliminal level, conditioning the audience to flinch at sounds that the characters themselves have learned to fear through hard experience. The relationship between the McCann brothers functions as the film's moral and emotional infrastructure, a support system as essential to the narrative as the ice is to the trucks. Mike's protective instinct toward Gertie is not presented as saintly or heroic, but as a fundamental fact of his existence, as natural and non-negotiable as breathing. Their dynamic inverts the traditional action movie sibling relationship, where the older brother must teach the younger to be tough. Instead, Gertie's vulnerability has taught Mike a form of tenderness that his rough exterior cannot fully conceal. The film suggests that caring for someone with a cognitive difference is not a burden that Mike bears, but the organizing principle that gives his otherwise chaotic life meaning and direction. Gertie's characterization as a veteran with aphasia represents one of the film's most nuanced attempts at representing invisible disabilities within a genre that typically valorizes physical perfection. His aphasia, a language disorder resulting from brain injury, manifests as word-finding difficulties and occasional semantic substitutions, symptoms that the film depicts with remarkable consistency rather than using them for convenient dramatic effect. Marcus Thomas's performance captures the frustration of a mind that knows exactly what it wants to communicate, but cannot bridge the gap between intention and expression, a silent struggle that occurs behind eyes that register every social slight and moment of condescension directed at him. The film refuses to infantilize Gertie, instead showing him as a fully competent adult whose intelligence operates through channels that neurotypical society neither values nor understands. The introduction of Tantu as a young indigenous woman claiming her place in a predominantly male, predominantly white profession carries significant representational weight that the film handles with varying degrees of success. Her character is introduced in the context of Goldenrod's garage, where she is clearly the most junior member, but also clearly the most determined, having fought for her position through channels the film wisely leaves unspoken. The decision to make her brother one of the trapped miners personalizes her stake in the mission without reducing her to a character motivated solely by familial obligation. She is a professional trucker in her own right, and her competence is established before her emotional connection to the mission is revealed. Midthunder brings a coiled intensity to the role, suggesting a woman who has learned that showing weakness in her profession is a luxury she cannot afford. The film's treatment of corporate villainy deserves examination as an example of how contemporary action cinema has shifted its antagonistic focus from foreign threats to domestic economic predators. Tom Varney is not a terrorist, a foreign agent, or a criminal mastermind in the traditional sense. He is an actuary, a professional risk calculator whose entire career consists of translating human life into dollar amounts. His villainy is the villainy of the spreadsheet, the cost-benefit analysis that determines which workers deserve rescue and which are more valuable as insurance payouts. This characterization reflects a post-financial crisis anxiety about the violence inherent in corporate logic, a violence that kills not with guns, but with deliberate negligence and carefully worded liability waivers. The scene in which Goldenrod's truck breaks through the ice is the film's most technically accomplished sequence and deserves careful structural analysis. The build-up employs classic Hitchcockian suspense mechanics, showing the audience the spreading cracks before the characters notice them, creating a gap between audience knowledge and character awareness that generates almost unbearable tension. When the ice finally gives way, the sequence shifts from suspense to horror with shocking speed, the massive truck tilting and sinking with a mechanical inevitability that makes Goldenrod's calm acceptance of his fate all the more devastating. His instruction to Tantu to cut the strap is delivered not as heroic declamation, but as a professional's final assessment of an unsalvageable situation, a decision made with the same pragmatic clarity he would apply to a broken axle or a seized engine. Fishburne's truncated presence in the film serves a structural purpose that may not be immediately apparent on first viewing. By establishing Goldenrod as a mentor figure and then violently removing him from the narrative, the film strips its remaining characters of their safety net, forcing Mike and Tantu to navigate the increasingly dangerous journey without the guidance of the one person who has made this trip before. This narrative maneuver raises the stakes by removing the possibility of an easy solution, compelling the protagonists to make decisions based on instinct rather than experience, and ensuring that their eventual success, should it come, will feel earned rather than inevitable. The conspiracy element introduced in the film's second half represents a significant tonal shift that has divided audiences, but makes logical sense within the film's thematic framework. The revelation that the mine's methane sensors were deliberately disabled transforms the rescue mission from a response to a tragic accident into a confrontation with a criminal cover-up. This shift from natural disaster to human malfeasance is essential to the film's political argument, which is that the true catastrophe is not the initial explosion, but the corporate culture of cost-cutting and regulatory evasion that made such an explosion statistically probable. The saboteur Varney is merely the logical endpoint of a system that values quarterly profits over worker safety. The fight choreography in the film deserves more credit than it typically receives in reviews that dismiss the film as generic action fare. The physical confrontations are characterized by awkwardness and desperation rather than martial artistry, reflecting the fact that these characters are truckers, not trained combatants. When Mike fights Varney, the struggle is clumsy and exhausting, both men slipping on frozen surfaces, grappling with numb fingers, and using improvised weapons scavenged from the truck's cargo. This anti-choreographic approach to violence reinforces the film's commitment to a working-class aesthetic, suggesting that real fights are not ballet performances but ugly, exhausting affairs that leave both participants damaged regardless of the outcome. The film's depiction of indigenous characters, while imperfect, represents a step forward from the erasure that characterizes much of the action genre's treatment of native populations. The miners trapped underground are predominantly indigenous, a demographic reality that accurately reflects the composition of the remote northern Canadian workforce in resource extraction industries. The film does not exoticize or mystify these characters. They are presented simply as working men facing a terrifying death, their ethnic identity neither ignored nor made the central focus of their characterization. This approach treats Indigenous presence in the industrial North as a simple fact rather than a narrative problem requiring explanation or justification. The mechanical knowledge displayed throughout the film, while occasionally simplified for dramatic clarity, demonstrates a respect for the technical expertise of long-haul truckers that is rare in mainstream cinema. The characters discuss engine temperatures, ice thickness tolerances, and winch capacities with a specificity that suggests genuine research, even if some of the physics are stretched for dramatic effect. This technical grounding gives the film a texture of authenticity that persists even when the plot veers into implausibility, anchoring the more fantastical elements in a concrete reality of diesel engines, hydraulic systems, and the immutable laws of thermodynamics that govern travel across frozen water. The avalanche sequence, while visually compromised by dated CGI, works thematically as a manifestation of the chaos that the characters have been courting since the journey began. An avalanche is nature's assertion of absolute power, an event that cannot be outsmarted or negotiated with, only survived through a combination of luck and instinct. The decision to trigger the avalanche with gunfire, while scientifically dubious, serves the narrative purpose of demonstrating Varney's willingness to weaponize the environment itself, transforming the natural world from an impartial threat into an active instrument of his murderous agenda. This escalation marks the point where the film fully commits to its conspiracy plot, abandoning any remaining pretense of a purely environmental thriller. The bridge sequence that culminates in Gertie's death is the film's narrative fulcrum and most emotionally devastating set piece. The condemned bridge represents a threshold between the natural threats of the ice road and the human threats that await at the mine, a liminal space where the rules of both worlds temporarily suspend themselves. The technical challenge of maneuvering a loaded rig across a structure designed for much lighter vehicles creates a puzzle box tension that the film sustains through careful escalation, each successive complication raising the stakes while remaining within the established logic of the situation. When Gertie wedges himself beneath the sliding truck's wheels, his action is both mechanically logical and emotionally annihilating, a moment where engineering and love converge in a single, irreversible gesture. Marcus Thomas's final scene as Gertie achieves a transcendence that the rest of the film, for all its noisy action, only intermittently approaches. His dying moments are played without sentimentality, his garbled reassurances to his brother carrying the weight of a lifetime of unsaid things. The repetition of I'm okay, while his body is visibly destroyed beneath the truck's weight, becomes a devastating inversion of the phrase's usual meaning. He is not okay, will never be okay again, but his concern is entirely for the brother who must witness this horror. Thomas's performance in this scene locates a profound dignity in Gertie's final moments, transforming what could have been a manipulative, tear-jerking beat into a genuinely earned moment of tragedy. The aftermath of Gertie's death reveals the film's true structural ambition, which is to function as a study in grief compressed into the remaining runtime of an action movie. Mike's continued pursuit of the mission is not driven by heroism or even by anger, though anger is present, but by a hollow automatism that will not allow him to stop moving because stopping would mean confronting the enormity of his loss. Neeson plays these final scenes as a man who has been gutted, his earlier gruff warmth replaced by a mechanical determination that is almost frightening in its intensity. The rescue of the miners becomes not a victory, but a grim fulfillment of an obligation that has already cost everything that mattered. The film's depiction of the mine interior during the climactic rescue creates a visual and tonal contrast with the ice road sequences that reinforces the thematic argument about the different faces of danger. The ice road was dangerous because of its openness, its exposure to the elements, its vast and different spaces. The mine is dangerous because of its confinement, its darkness, its status as a constructed environment that has turned against its creators. This movement from exterior to interior, from natural threat to man-made hell, mirrors the narrative trajectory from environmental thriller to corporate exposé, suggesting that the most dangerous place in the world is not the frozen wilderness, but the profit-driven workplace. The final confrontation between Mike and the forces of corporate malfeasance is resolved not through a traditional action movie shootout, but through a chain of mechanical problem-solving that honors the film's trucking premise. Mike's victory comes from understanding how machinery works under stress, how loads shift, how winches can be redirected, and how gravity can be weaponized by someone who has spent a lifetime working with rather than against physical forces. This conclusion reinforces the film's persistent argument that the skills of the working class are not merely serviceable, but genuinely heroic, a form of intelligence that the corporate villains, for all their education and authority, cannot match when the situation demands practical rather than bureaucratic solutions. The epilogue, set 3 months after the rescue, is deliberately subdued, resisting the temptation to end on a triumphant note that would betray the tragedy that preceded it. Tantu's inheritance of Goldenrod's garage suggests a passing of generational knowledge and an economic future that remains rooted in the working-class community the film has depicted. Mike's arrival in a new gold truck with the personalized license plate honoring Gertie's catchphrase is a gesture of remembrance that is deeply personal and entirely free of public ceremony, a private memorial that will travel the highways as long as Mike continues to drive. This ending understands that for people like these characters, grief is not an event but a landscape, something to be traversed daily rather than overcome and left behind. The film's engagement with the traditions of Canadian cinema, while perhaps unintentional, places it in a lineage of survival narratives that distinguish themselves from their American counterparts through a different relationship with landscape. American survival stories typically treat wilderness as an adversary to be conquered, a proving ground for individualist determination. Canadian survival narratives, from the novels of Margaret Atwood to the films of Zacharias Kunuk, more often treat nature as an absolute reality to be accommodated rather than defeated, a force whose terms are non-negotiable. The Ice Road, despite its Hollywood production context, leans toward this Canadian sensibility, presenting the ice not as a villain, but as a condition of existence that demands respect and punishes arrogance. The professional relationship between Mike and Tantu develops through the shared language of trucking rather than through conventional bonding scenes. Their communication consists largely of technical exchanges, assessments of road conditions, engine performance, and route calculations, a vocabulary of competence that builds trust more effectively than personal revelation. This approach to character development through professional interaction is rare in mainstream cinema, which typically insists that emotional intimacy requires the exchange of personal histories and vulnerabilities. The film suggests, correctly, that people who work dangerous jobs together develop bonds that are no less profound for being expressed through discussions of tire pressure and ice thickness. The film's treatment of risk assessment as a moral rather than purely mathematical exercise is central to its critique of corporate culture. Varney's actuarial training has taught him to view risk as an abstraction, a statistical probability to be managed through insurance premiums and liability waivers. The truckers understand risk as an embodied experience, a physical sensation in the gut when the ice groans beneath the wheels, a calculation made with life rather than with numbers. This epistemological conflict between abstract and embodied knowledge runs throughout the film, and the narrative consistently validates the truckers' way of knowing over the actuaries, suggesting that some truths are only available to those who put their bodies on the line. The film's CGI limitations, while frequently cited as a weakness, have the paradoxical effect of making the practical stunts and location shooting more impressive by comparison. When real trucks drive across real frozen surfaces, the authenticity of the physics is palpable in a way that the digital ice cracks cannot match. This inconsistency in visual quality inadvertently teaches the audience to distinguish between the real and the simulated, heightening appreciation for the physical production while lowering tolerance for the computer-generated spectacle. A film with uniformly excellent digital effects might not make the practical elements stand out so clearly. The unevenness of the effects work becomes an unintentional tribute to the stunt drivers and location crew. The supporting character of Renee Lampard, played by Holt McCallany, functions as a representative of the trapped miners and a counterpoint to the surface-level villainy. Lampard's presence underground, his attempts to maintain order among increasingly desperate men, mirrors Mike's leadership on the surface, suggesting a distributed heroism that the corporate structure has failed to recognize or reward. The brief cuts to the miners' deteriorating situation serve as a constant reminder of the stakes, a countdown that runs parallel to the ice road journey, and that the film never allows the audience to forget, even during the most distracting action sequences. The film's political orientation has been the subject of considerable debate among audiences, with some viewing it as a straightforward critique of corporate malfeasance and others detecting a conservative celebration of individual heroism over collective action. This ambiguity is arguably the film's most sophisticated quality, allowing it to function as a Rorschach test for viewers' own political assumptions. The Union is depicted as ineffectual, yet the individual heroes act in service of a collective rescue. The indigenous characters are centered, yet their salvation depends on white protagonists. These tensions remain unresolved in the text, creating a productive friction that more ideologically consistent films might avoid. The film's relationship to the wages of fear extends beyond the obvious premise of transporting dangerous cargo to a disaster site. Clouseau's film was fundamentally about the desperation that drives men to accept suicidal work, a critique of the economic conditions that make such choices rational. The Ice Road updates this critique for a 21st century context, replacing the post-colonial exploitation of the original with the corporate exploitation of a deregulated resource economy. The truckers in Hensley's film are not desperate migrants but skilled professionals whose options have been foreclosed by an economic system that treats their expertise as a commodity to be purchased cheaply and discarded easily. The physical toll of the journey on the characters' bodies is depicted with a degree of realism that is unusual for the action genre. Characters accumulate injuries that do not heal conveniently between scenes. They limp, favor damaged limbs, and exhibit the slow, deliberate movements of people whose bodies have been pushed past normal limits. This commitment to bodily consequence grounds the action in a physical reality that counterbalances the more fantastical plot developments, reminding the audience that beneath the CGI and the melodramatic twists, there are human bodies that bruise, break, and bleed according to the same physics that govern the real world. The film's dialogue, while functional rather than poetic, contains moments of working-class eloquence that capture the cadences of people who communicate primarily through understatement. When Mike tells Gertie, "You're the best mechanic I know," the simplicity of the statement carries more weight than a more elaborate declaration ever could. This verbal economy, a language of short sentences and loaded silences, accurately reflects the communication patterns of people who have spent their lives in loud truck cabs, where every word must fight against engine noise and road vibration to be heard. The color grading of the film deserves attention as a storytelling tool that operates below the level of conscious perception. The blue cast that dominates the exterior scenes is not merely a realistic representation of northern light, but a psychological color that signals cold, isolation, and emotional numbness. The brief flashes of warmth, the orange of the truck's cab lights, the red of safety equipment, the yellow of heavy machinery, become beacons of human presence in an otherwise inhospitable visual field. This color strategy creates a visual hierarchy of safety and danger that guides the audience's emotional responses more reliably than the dialogue or the plot. The film's pacing follows a deliberate rhythm of tension accumulation and release that mimics the experience of long-haul driving. Periods of relative calm, during which characters talk, plan, and recover, alternate with bursts of intense action that exhaust the audience's adrenaline reserves before receding into another period of anxious waiting. This rhythm is more sophisticated than the relentless escalation favored by many contemporary action films, and it reflects Hensley's experience as a screenwriter who understands that suspense requires variation in intensity rather than a constant barrage of stimulation. The geographical specificity of the film's Manitoba locations contributes a sense of place that generic studio backlots could not replicate. The particular quality of the light, the specific texture of the snow, the exact configuration of the tree lines, all these details accumulate into a portrait of a real region rather than a generic northern setting. This geographical authenticity grounds the more outlandish plot developments in a concrete reality, providing a foundation of verisimilitude that helps the audience accept the narrative's more improbable turns. The film's sound mix prioritizes diegetic sound over score during its most tense sequences, a choice that heightens the documentary-like immediacy of the action. The groaning ice, the straining engines, the wind, and the characters' labored breathing create a sonic environment that is immersive in its specificity. The score, when it does enter, functions more as punctuation than as continuous emotional guidance, allowing the audience to experience the tension directly rather than being told how to feel by the music. This restraint in the use of non-diegetic sound is increasingly rare in contemporary action cinema and contributes significantly to the film's distinctive texture. The film's reception as a Netflix original during a period when theatrical releases were severely limited by the pandemic shaped its critical evaluation in ways that are difficult to disentangle from the film's intrinsic qualities. The compression of the image, the distractions of the home viewing environment, and the lowered expectations associated with streaming premieres all contributed to a critical discourse that may have undervalued the film's craft. Viewed on a large screen in ideal conditions, the landscape photography and sound design achieve an impact that laptop speakers and compressed streaming signals cannot fully convey. The film's exploration of masculinity deserves more nuanced attention than the dismissive label of dad cinema allows. The male characters in The Ice Road are defined not by stoic emotional repression, but by their relationships of care and responsibility. Mike's care for Gertie, Goldenrod's mentoring of Tantu, Lampard's leadership of the miners. These are masculinities organized around service rather than dominance. And the film's most admired character, Gertie, is one whose cognitive difference places him outside traditional masculine hierarchies entirely. The film suggests that true strength lies in the capacity to care for others rather than in the capacity to dominate them. The logistics of filming on actual ice roads impose constraints that are visible in the final product and that distinguish it from entirely studio-bound productions. The limited shooting windows, the safety protocols required for working on frozen water, and the mechanical challenges of operating heavy vehicles in extreme cold all contribute to a sense of authenticity that more controlled productions cannot replicate. The crew's shared experience of genuine physical discomfort during the Manitoba winter shoot creates a verisimilitude in the performances that method acting cannot simulate. The shivering is real, the numb fingers are real, and the urgency to complete a shot before the light changes is a production reality that translates into narrative tension. The film's legacy, solidified by the announcement and release of a sequel, is that of a modest genre exercise that exceeded commercial expectations despite critical indifference. The Ice Road found its audience, an audience that recognized in its unpretentious commitment to blue-collar heroism something that more prestigious films had neglected to provide. The sequel's move to Nepal suggests a franchise logic that will test whether the appeal of the original was specific to its northern setting or portable to other extreme environments, a question that speaks to the fundamental nature of the film's success. The film's use of parallel editing between the surface journey and the underground entrapment creates a spatial relationship between two groups of working people who are literally separated by tons of rock and ice, but united by their shared vulnerability to corporate decisions made in distant boardrooms. This parallel structure suggests a solidarity that the characters may not consciously recognize, but that the film's form makes visible to the audience. The miners and the truckers never meet until the final rescue, yet the editing insists on their connection, proposing a community of risk that transcends physical separation. The character of Varney represents a particular kind of villainy that has become increasingly prevalent in 21st century cinema, the educated professional whose intelligence is entirely instrumental, divorced from any ethical framework. His actuarial training has given him a vocabulary for translating moral questions into technical ones, for recasting murder as risk management and sabotage as asset protection. This character type reflects a cultural anxiety about the moral neutrality of expertise, the fear that technical competence without ethical commitment produces a particularly efficient form of evil that can justify itself in the language of professional necessity. The film's final image, Mike's new truck bearing the license plate that memorializes his brother's spirit, is a study in understated grief that honors the emotional complexity of working-class masculinity. The truck is not a shrine but a tool, something that will continue to work and earn and move through the world. Its memorial function is private, legible only to those who know the code. This ending understands that for people who work with their hands, the most meaningful tribute is not a statue or a speech but an object of use, something that continues the work that the dead can no longer do, carrying their memory forward into every mile that remains to be driven. The film's opening sequence at the trucking company depot establishes a visual economy of character through costume and set design that operates with remarkable efficiency before any significant dialogue is spoken. Mike McCann's worn leather jacket, frayed at the cuffs and stained with grease that no amount of washing will remove, tells the story of years spent in truck cabs and under lifted hoods in every weather condition the northern plains can conjure. Gertie's meticulously maintained work boots, laced with a precision that contrasts with his otherwise rumpled appearance, silently communicates his mechanical fastidiousness before we ever see him diagnose an engine problem by ear alone. The depot itself, with its fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and its concrete floor polished by decades of boot traffic, establishes a world of unglamorous labor that the film will never ask us to romanticize or pity, simply to acknowledge as the foundation upon which everything else depends. The decision to make Gertie an Iraq War veteran introduces a political dimension that the film handles with surprising restraint given the genre's tendency toward either jingoistic celebration or heavy-handed critique of American military intervention. Gertie's service is mentioned matter-of-factly, never elaborated into flashback or patriotic speechifying, existing simply as a biographical fact that explains both his mechanical expertise and his psychological wounds without reducing him to either. The film suggests, through this narrative choice, that the costs of war continue to be paid long after the deployments end, in the compromised neural pathways of veterans whose sacrifices are acknowledged more readily in political rhetoric than in the disability benefits, healthcare access, and workplace accommodations that would constitute genuine national gratitude. This quiet political observation never disrupts the thriller momentum, but adds a layer of social commentary accessible to viewers inclined to notice it. The mine explosion that sets the plot in motion is depicted through a combination of practical effects and digital enhancement that prioritizes the human cost over the spectacle of destruction. Rather than lingering on the fireball, the film cuts quickly to the miner's experience of the event, the sudden darkness, the choking dust, the immediate assessment of injuries in the confined space, establishing the stakes as personal rather than spectacular. The methane gas that caused the explosion is itself invisible, a silent killer whose presence can only be detected by instruments that the mine's management has deliberately disabled, making the catastrophe a consequence not of nature's unpredictable fury, but of human choices made in offices far removed from the underground chambers where men work and die. The casting of Laurence Fishburne as Jim Goldenrod represents a significant intervention in the racial politics of a genre that has historically centered white protagonists almost exclusively. Goldenrod's authority is never questioned on the basis of race, his expertise established entirely through his professional reputation and his calm command of the situations he encounters. The film treats his presence as a black business owner in rural Manitoba as entirely unremarkable, a normalization that constitutes its own form of progressive representation by refusing to make race a narrative issue. This approach has its own complications, potentially erasing the real experiences of racism that a black trucking company owner might encounter in such a setting, but it also refuses the equally problematic tendency to reduce characters of color to their experiences of discrimination, allowing Goldenrod to simply exist as the most competent person in any room he enters. The technical specifications of the wellheads that must be transported to the mine are not arbitrary numbers, but carefully researched details that ground the mission's difficulty in engineering reality. 30 tons of steel and precision machinery, designed to cap a methane leak at depths that would crush an unprotected human body instantly, cannot be broken down into smaller loads or transported by air. The wellhead's weight, their dimensions, their absolute necessity for the rescue, all these factors combine to make the ice road journey not a dramatic choice, but an engineering inevitability, the only solution that physics and logistics will permit. This attention to technical constraint distinguishes the film from action movies, where the mission parameters feel arbitrarily designed to create drama, rather than emerging organically from the situation's material conditions. The film's treatment of the 30-hour deadline functions as a masterclass in sustained temporal pressure, a countdown that operates simultaneously on multiple levels of narrative organization. The explicit countdown, mentioned in dialogue and occasionally reinforced by on-screen text, creates the macro-level urgency that justifies the mission's suicidal risk profile. The implicit countdown, conveyed through the deteriorating ice conditions, the approaching storm system, and the dwindling daylight hours of the northern spring, creates a micro-level pressure that makes every delay, every mechanical failure, every necessary detour feel like a potentially fatal accumulation of lost minutes. This layered temporal structure ensures that the audience never relaxes into the assumption that the protagonists will succeed because the genre demands it, maintaining the possibility of failure as a genuine dramatic option until the final moments. The relationship between Tantu and her brother Cody, while largely conveyed through her dialogue about him rather than scenes of them together, provides an emotional counterweight to the Mike-Gertie relationship that expands the film's exploration of familial obligation. Where Mike's bond with Gertie is characterized by protection and advocacy against a world that misunderstands cognitive difference, Tantu's bond with Cody is characterized by shared experience of a community and a way of life that the mining economy both sustains and threatens. Her determination to save her brother is not merely personal but representative, a fight for the survival of a family unit that carries the weight of a larger cultural continuity. The parallel between these two sibling relationships suggests that the impulse to save one's kin is universal, while the specific forms it takes are shaped by the particular vulnerabilities and strengths of each family's circumstances. The film's depiction of the ice itself as an active antagonist requires a sophisticated blend of scientific accuracy and dramatic license that the film navigates with varying degrees of success. Real ice roads are engineering marvels, carefully maintained and continuously monitored, with strict protocols governing vehicle weights, speeds, and spacing that make catastrophic failure exceedingly rare. The film acknowledges this reality through Goldenrod's expertise, while also presenting a scenario where the normal safety margins have been erased by the seasonal thaw and the urgency of the mission. The dramatic exaggeration of the ice's fragility serves the thriller mechanics, while the grounding in genuine ice road practices provides enough verisimilitude to maintain audience investment in the premise. The scene in which the convoy first encounters serious ice trouble, with cracks propagating across the frozen surface in patterns that resemble lightning strikes rendered in monochrome, deploys the visual vocabulary of disaster cinema while maintaining a connection to observable physical phenomena. Ice under stress does crack in branching patterns, does emit sounds that travel faster through the frozen medium than through air, does fail in ways that can cascade from initial fracture to catastrophic collapse with terrifying speed. The film amplifies these real characteristics for dramatic effect, pushing the physics to their breaking point, just as the characters push their trucks to theirs, creating a correspondence between mechanical stress and narrative tension that operates at the level of form as well as content. The character of the truck itself deserves analysis as a prosthetic extension of the driver's body and will, a mechanical exoskeleton that translates human decisions into the movement of tons of steel across impossible terrain. The film's attention to the specific controls, the gear shifts that require precise timing, the brake systems that must be feathered rather than stomped, the steering inputs that must anticipate the trailer's lag rather than respond to immediate circumstances. All these details construct the truck not as a simple vehicle, but as a complex instrument that demands virtuoso performance from its operator. This instrumental relationship between driver and machine elevates trucking from a job to a discipline, a practice with its own standards of excellence that the film's protagonists embody and its antagonists fail to comprehend. The film's sound design during the ice-cracking sequences employs infrasound, frequencies below the threshold of conscious hearing that nonetheless produce physiological anxiety responses in human listeners. This technique, more commonly associated with horror cinema, creates a visceral unease that bypasses cognitive evaluation and speaks directly to the body's threat detection systems. The groaning ice becomes not merely a sound effect but an embodied experience, a vibration that the audience feels in their chest cavities even if they cannot identify its source. This subliminal sonic manipulation is one of the film's most effective tools for maintaining tension during sequences where the visual information alone might not sustain the desired level of dread. The corporate conspiracy subplot, which some critics identified as a tonal disruption, actually represents a logical extension of the film's thematic preoccupation with the gap between those who make decisions and those who bear their consequences. The mine's executives, comfortable in offices hundreds of miles from the underground drifts where methane accumulates invisibly, have made choices that prioritize production targets over safety protocols, choices that are rational within the narrow framework of quarterly earnings reports, but murderous within the broader framework of human life. Varney's active sabotage merely makes explicit what the corporate structure already implies. that the company regards its workers as liabilities to be managed rather than as human beings whose lives have intrinsic value. The film's treatment of indigenous identity avoids several common representational pitfalls, while arguably falling into others that are less obvious, but equally problematic. Tantu is neither a mystical figure possessed of ancient environmental wisdom, nor a victim whose suffering exists primarily to motivate white protagonists. She is a competent professional whose knowledge of the terrain is explained by her experience rather than her ethnicity. However, the film's decision to make the trapped miners predominantly indigenous, while reflecting demographic reality, also creates a structure in which indigenous characters are largely passive recipients of rescue rather than active agents of their own survival. This structural problem is not unique to The Ice Road, but reflects broader patterns in mainstream cinema's difficulty in centering indigenous agency within narratives that also require audience identification figures for predominantly non-indigenous viewership. The film's color palette during the mine sequences shifts dramatically from the cool blues and whites of the surface to the warm, almost infernal reds and oranges of the underground, a visual strategy that transforms the mine into an image of hell that corporate greed has constructed for its workers. This color shift operates as moral commentary through purely visual means, associating the surface with a harsh but honest natural order and the underground with a corrupt human-made system that consumes lives for profit. The rescue, when it finally occurs, represents not merely a return to the surface, but a movement from damnation to a kind of qualified salvation, a rebirth that is shadowed by the knowledge of all that has been lost to achieve it. The film's handling of Gertie's death, the narrative fulcrum upon which the entire emotional structure pivots, avoids the sentimentality that a lesser film would have deployed by focusing on the mechanical reality of what he is doing rather than on swelling music or tearful farewell speeches. Gertie wedges himself beneath the truck's wheels because he has calculated, with the intuitive physics of a natural mechanic, that his body can provide just enough friction to prevent the rig from sliding backward over the bridge's edge. His action is simultaneously an act of love and an act of engineering, a solution to a mechanical problem that uses the only material still available to him. The film honors this by showing the mechanics clearly rather than obscuring them in a blur of emotion, allowing the audience to understand exactly what he is doing and exactly what it costs him. The aftermath of Gertie's death transforms Mike from a character motivated by protective love into one driven by something colder and more frightening, a completion imperative that has detached itself from any hope of personal reward. The rescue mission continues not because Mike still believes in saving the miners, though that remains the official objective, but because stopping would require him to inhabit a stillness in which grief would catch up to him. Neeson's performance in these scenes strips away the gruff charm that characterized his earlier interactions, revealing a core of desolation that the action genre rarely permits its heroes to display so nakedly. This is not the righteous anger of the revenge thriller, but something more existential, a confrontation with the meaninglessness of survival when the person for whom one survived is gone. The film's treatment of Varney's eventual defeat carries a poetic justice that operates on multiple levels of signification. The actuary who calculated human life in terms of risk percentages and liability exposure is killed by the very machinery whose safety he compromised, crushed by a weight that reduces his body to the same physical vulnerability he refused to acknowledge in the workers whose lives he casually sacrificed. His death is not a moment of triumph but of grim satisfaction, a restoration of moral order that comes too late to undo the damage he has caused. The film understands that villain deaths in action cinema serve a cathartic function that is more ritual than realistic, a symbolic expulsion of the evil that the narrative has conjured in order to defeat. The epilogue's presentation of Tantu working in Goldenrod's garage carries implications for her character's trajectory that the film wisely leaves unexplored rather than over-explaining. Her presence in the shop, her evident comfort with its tools and routines, suggests a future in which she has claimed an institutional role previously occupied by a man who believed in her capabilities. This inheritance is economic as well as symbolic, a transfer of capital and knowledge that represents one possible path for indigenous economic empowerment within industries that have historically extracted value from indigenous lands without returning it to indigenous communities. The film does not belabor this point, allowing it to register subliminally for viewers attuned to such implications while remaining simply a satisfying character beat for those who are not. The license plate that appears in the film's final shot, bearing the inscription that memorializes Gertie's verbal tick, functions as a cinematic haiku that condenses the entire emotional journey into a single image. The plate is simultaneously a joke, a tribute, a promise, and a declaration of continuity, a way of saying that Gertie will continue to ride these highways as long as Mike continues to drive them. The choice to end on this image rather than on a more conventional resolution, a group celebration, a romantic pairing, a heroic pose, demonstrates a confidence in the audience's ability to find closure in the symbolic register rather than requiring it in the literal one. It is the kind of ending that lingers precisely because it refuses to explain itself. The film's engagement with disability representation extends beyond Gertie's aphasia to include a broader critique of how productivity-obsessed cultures value human beings based on their economic output rather than their intrinsic worth. Gertie's mechanical genius would be a highly marketable skill in a different social context, one that accommodated his communication differences rather than treating them as disqualifying deficits. The film suggests that the problem is not Gertie's disability, but society's limited imagination about how intelligence can manifest, a critique that applies equally to workplaces, educational systems, and the casual cruelties of neurotypical people who mistake verbal fluency for intellectual superiority. The practical effects work involving the trucks deserves recognition that the film's critical reception largely failed to provide, focusing as it did on the shortcomings of the digital effects rather than the achievements of the physical production. Real trucks were driven across real frozen surfaces by real stunt drivers who risked genuine danger to capture footage that no computer-generated imagery could fully simulate. The weight of the vehicles, their momentum, their terrifying slowness in responding to steering inputs on ice, all these physical realities are present in the practical footage and contribute to a texture of authenticity that persists even when the digital effects intrude upon it. The film's geographical specificity extends to its accurate representation of the distance between Winnipeg and the fictional Katka mine, a journey of hundreds of kilometers through increasingly remote territory where cell phone coverage disappears and mechanical self-sufficiency becomes the only guarantee of survival. This sense of distance, of progressive removal from civilization and its support systems, creates a spatial isolation that mirrors the characters' growing psychological isolation as their numbers dwindle and their options narrow. The landscape becomes not merely a setting, but a force that shapes the narrative's possibilities, determining what can and cannot be done as surely as any human antagonist. The film's use of radio communication as a narrative device creates a soundscape of crackling voices and sudden silences that captures the fragility of human connection in extreme environments. The radios work intermittently, their range limited by terrain and atmospheric conditions, their batteries constantly threatening to die at crucial moments. This technological precariousness adds another layer of tension to the journey, making communication itself a resource that can be depleted, a lifeline that can be severed without warning, leaving the characters isolated in their individual trucks with only their own judgments to rely upon. The film's treatment of weather as an active narrative agent rather than a passive background condition reflects an understanding of northern environments that goes beyond Hollywood cliché. The weather in the ice road is not merely cold but dynamically dangerous, changing rapidly and unpredictably, forcing constant recalculation of routes and risks. The approaching storm system that complicates the mission's later stages is introduced early and developed consistently, its arrival time to coincide with the narrative's moment of maximum vulnerability, creating a convergence of threats that pushes the characters beyond their already strained capacities. The film's understanding of class as a system of differential exposure to risk is articulated through its structure rather than its dialogue, through who dies and who survives and under what circumstances. The corporate executive who authorized the safety violations never sets foot on the ice road. His risk is entirely legal and financial, consequences that can be managed by lawyers and insurance policies. The workers who had no role in those decisions, the miners and the truckers sent to rescue them, bear the physical risk, the risk of crushed bodies and frozen limbs and drowning in water cold enough to stop the heart in minutes. This differential distribution of risk according to class position is the film's most sustained political observation, made through narrative consequence rather than rhetorical statement. The film's relationship to the action cinema of the 1990s, the period when screenwriter Jonathan Hensley established his reputation with scripts for films like Die Hard with a Vengeance and Armageddon, is evident in its commitment to practical problem-solving as the engine of action sequences. The characters in the ice road succeed not because they are stronger or faster than their opponents, but because they understand the mechanical systems they are operating better than their opponents understand the systems they are trying to sabotage. This emphasis on competence over physical dominance reflects a tradition of action filmmaking that has been partially displaced by the superhero-driven emphasis on innate extraordinary abilities, a tradition that the ice road works, however imperfectly, to preserve. The film's potential as a teaching text for film students lies not in its perfection, but in its illustrative imperfections. The visible seams where budget constraints, script problems, and directorial choices intersect with audience expectations and genre conventions. The gaps between the film's ambitions and its achievements are themselves instructive, revealing the pressures that shape contemporary mid-budget action cinema and the compromises that even experienced filmmakers must make when operating within the constraints of streaming platform production economics. A film that succeeded in everything it attempted would be less useful for understanding how films actually get made than one whose failures are as visible as its successes. The sequel's relocation of the action to Nepal represents a geographical and conceptual expansion that will test whether the franchise's appeal resides in the specific conditions of ice road trucking or in the more portable premise of a working-class hero navigating extreme environments with heavy machinery. The shift from horizontal travel across frozen lakes to vertical travel up mountain roads suggests a franchise logic that identifies the essential element not as ice but as gradient, not as cold but as the defiance of gravity itself through mechanical skill and existential determination. Whether this conceptual translation succeeds will depend on whether the sequel maintains the original's commitment to the specific material conditions of its setting rather than defaulting to generic action sequences that could occur anywhere. The film's quietest moments, the scenes in truck cabs between crises when the characters have nothing to do but wait and worry, contain some of its most effective character work. Mike and Gertie's shared silences, comfortable with each other in ways that make dialogue unnecessary, establish the depth of their bond more effectively than any number of expository flashbacks to their childhood could achieve. Tanta's solitary moments behind the wheel, her face illuminated by dashboard lights as she calculates fuel consumption and remaining distance, reveal the concentration and competence that her dialogue with others sometimes obscures. These moments of stillness amid the chaos are the film's breathing spaces, the rests in the rhythm that make the action sequences legible as deviations from a baseline rather than as a continuous, exhausting barrage. The film's understanding of masculinity as a performance that can be critiqued without being rejected entirely is unusual for a genre that typically either celebrates traditional masculine stoicism uncritically or deconstructs it so thoroughly that no positive model remains. Mike McCann is clearly performing a version of masculinity that has costs for himself and others: his violent temper, his emotional constriction, his difficulty asking for or accepting help. Yet the film does not condemn him for these traits, instead showing how they are adaptive responses to a world that has given him few other resources for expressing care. His growth over the course of the film is not toward a different kind of masculinity, but toward a more conscious inhabitation of the masculinity he already possesses, a recognition of its limitations, and a willingness to supplement it with other modes of being when the situation demands. The film's final moments, with Mike driving away in his new truck bearing the memorial license plate, suggest a future that is neither happy nor hopeless, but simply ongoing. He will continue to drive, continue to haul loads across frozen lakes and mountain passes, continue to carry his brother's memory into every truck stop and way station and delivery dock he encounters. This is not the triumphant ride into the sunset that concludes so many action films, but something more ambivalent and arguably more honest. Recognition that survival is not the same as victory, and that some losses are not compensated by any subsequent gain, only incorporated into the ongoing project of living. The truck, like grief itself, is something you learn to operate, something that becomes part of you, something that takes you forward even when you are not sure you want to go. The film's opening frames establish a chromatic austerity that functions as an immediate immersion into the sensory deprivation of northern Manitoba in late winter, a world stripped of the greens and vibrant hues that signal life and warmth in more temperate latitudes. This near monochromatic palette of whites, grays, and muted blues is not merely an aesthetic choice but a physiological one, replicating the visual experience of snow blindness, where the overwhelming brightness paradoxically reduces the world to a flat, featureless expanse that confuses depth perception and spatial orientation. The human figures moving through this landscape become the only warm-toned elements in the frame, their skin and clothing registering as intrusions of organic matter into an inorganic realm, a visual argument for the fundamental incompatibility between human life and the environment through which the characters must travel. The mechanical sounds of the trucks, specifically the distinctive whine of turbochargers straining against cold-thickened engine oil, and the percussive rattle of diesel engines operating at temperatures far below their optimal range, create an auditory texture that anyone familiar with heavy machinery in winter conditions will recognize immediately. This sonic authenticity extends to the way the truck's sounds change as they move from packed snow to bare ice to the brief patches of gravel that mark the transition points between lake crossings, each surface producing a different harmonic from the tires and suspension, a symphony of friction that the experienced truckers in the film read as precisely as a navigator reads charts. The audience may not consciously register these variations, but they contribute to the subliminal conviction that this is a real world governed by real physics. The film's treatment of Gertie's aphasia extends beyond the obvious symptoms of word-finding difficulty to include the less visible but equally disabling challenges of auditory processing. The slight delay between hearing words and comprehending them that makes rapid-fire conversation an exhausting gauntlet rather than a natural exchange. Marcus Thomas's performance captures this processing lag in microexpressions, a fleeting blankness that crosses his face before comprehension arrives, a fraction of a second that separates him from the conversational rhythm that neurotypical speakers take for granted. This performance detail transforms Gertie from a collection of diagnostic criteria into a fully realized human being whose internal experience, while different from the norm, is rich and coherent on its own terms. The social dynamics within the trucking company from which Mike and Gertie are fired at the film's opening reveal a workplace hierarchy in which bullying is not merely tolerated, but implicitly encouraged as a mechanism for enforcing conformity to ableist norms. The coworker who mocks Gertie's speech patterns is not an outlier, but a symptom of a culture that has not been challenged to accommodate cognitive difference. A culture that treats deviation from neurological norms as a legitimate target for humiliation, rather than a variation in human functioning that requires only reasonable accommodation to become a source of strength rather than stigma. Mike's violent response, while legally and professionally indefensible, is morally legible as the desperate act of someone who has exhausted all institutional channels for protecting his brother and has been left with nothing but his fists. The film's geography lesson, delivered through the map sequences that punctuate the journey, educates the audience in the specific topography of the Canadian Shield, that vast expanse of ancient rock, boreal forest, and interconnected waterways that forms the geological basement of North America. The ice roads that cross this territory are not permanent infrastructure, but seasonal improvisations, routes that exist only because the lakes freeze thick enough to support trucks that weigh as much as small buildings. This temporariness gives the journey an existential dimension that permanent roads do not possess. The path itself is ephemeral, a brief window of accessibility that will close with the spring thaw regardless of whether the mission succeeds or fails. The logistical challenges of filming a sequence in which a truck breaks through the ice and sinks into freezing water required a combination of practical effects, stunt coordination, and digital compositing that represents one of the production's most significant technical achievements. The safety protocols for such a sequence are extraordinarily complex, involving standby divers in dry suits, emergency extraction equipment, and water temperatures carefully monitored to ensure that the actor's exposure remains within medically safe limits. The resulting footage, combining real trucks on real ice with digital extensions that complete the illusion of catastrophic failure, achieves a visceral impact that pure computer-generated imagery, no matter how photorealistic, struggles to match because the audience can sense, at some preconscious level, the presence of genuine physical danger in the performances. The character of Jim Goldenrod functions as a tragic father figure whose death early in the narrative creates an absence that shapes every subsequent decision made by the surviving characters. His mentorship of Tantu, only briefly sketched before his death, becomes a legacy that she carries forward. His lessons about ice reading and load distribution, and the subtle art of keeping a truck moving when every instinct screams to stop becoming the internal voice that guides her through the crises that follow. Fishburne's performance in his brief screen time is weighted with the authority of someone who has made this journey many times and knows, with the fatalism of long experience, that one of these trips will be his last. The film's understanding of the corporate chain of culpability is more sophisticated than its critics have acknowledged, distinguishing between the different levels of responsibility that characterize modern corporate malfeasance. The mine manager Sickle is a functionary whose villainy is petty and personal, the sadism of a small man granted power over those who cannot easily escape his authority. Varney represents a higher order of corporate evil, the professional who translates institutional greed into operational reality through the language of actuarial science and risk management. Above them both, glimpsed only briefly, are the executives and shareholders whose demands for profitability create the pressure that trickles down into disabled safety equipment and falsified inspection reports. The film's depiction of the trapped miner's experience underground employs a sound design strategy that is the inverse of the surface sequences, replacing the vast reverberant spaces of the frozen lakes with the claustrophobic deadness of sound in confined underground chambers. The miners' voices are close-mic'd, intimate, their breathing and the shuffling of their bodies against rock surfaces creating an acoustic environment of oppressive proximity that contrasts with the howling winds and groaning ice of the surface sequences. This sonic contrast between the two parallel storylines reinforces the spatial separation while creating a thematic unity. Both groups are trapped in environments that are indifferent to their survival, whether those environments are natural or constructed. The film's use of practical locations in Manitoba, rather than soundstages or digital environments, represents a commitment to verisimilitude that is increasingly rare in contemporary action cinema. The cold that the actors experience is not simulated. Their breath visible in the air, their involuntary shivers, their stiff-fingered manipulation of equipment are all genuine responses to an environment that is actually as hostile as the fiction presents it. This authenticity of response cannot be replicated by actors pretending to be cold on a climate-controlled soundstage, and it contributes significantly to the film's ability to maintain audience immersion, even when the plotting stretches credulity to its breaking point. The subplot concerning the mine's methane sensors, deliberately covered to prevent them from triggering production-stopping alarms, is based on documented practices in the resource extraction industry where safety equipment has been tampered with to maintain productivity targets. This grounding in real-world corporate malfeasance gives the film's conspiracy plot a documentary dimension that elevates it above the generic corporate villainy of lesser thrillers. The audience's outrage is not directed at a fictional construct, but at a recognizable pattern of behavior that has resulted in real mining disasters, real deaths, and real cover-ups, a connection to actual events that the film leverages without ever becoming preachy or didactic. The film's editing rhythm during the ice-crossing sequences employs a technique of delayed resolution that is structurally similar to the musical device of suspension, where a dissonant note is held before resolving to consonance. A shot of the truck's wheels spinning on a patch of smooth ice, a cut to the driver's face registering dawning alarm, a wider shot revealing the spreading cracks, a return to the wheels finding sudden traction. This pattern of tension, escalation, and release operates with the precision of a metronome, training the audience's nervous systems to anticipate disaster and then providing the relief of continued safety, only to begin the cycle again with the next patch of suspect ice. The film's treatment of Tantu's indigeneity avoids the trap of making her a spokesperson for an entire culture while still acknowledging the specific relationship that Indigenous communities in northern Canada have with the resource extraction industries that both employ and exploit them. Her family's dependence on mining jobs is presented as an economic reality rather than a political problem. The complex negotiation between cultural continuity and economic necessity that characterizes many Indigenous communities' relationships with industrial development on their traditional territories. The film does not resolve this tension or even comment on it explicitly. It simply presents it as the background condition of Tantu's life, a reality that shapes her choices without determining them. The film's action sequences are choreographed around the physics of large masses in motion, a kinetic logic that is fundamentally different from the martial arts or gunplay that dominate most action cinema. A truck weighing 40 tons cannot change direction quickly. Its momentum commits it to a course of action long before the consequences of that course become apparent. This physical constraint creates a distinctive form of action tension, one based not on speed and agility, but on commitment and consequence. The terrifying gap between a decision and its outcome during which the driver can only watch and hope that the initial calculation was correct. The portrayal of the Northern Lights, glimpsed briefly during a night sequence, serves as a reminder of the natural beauty that persists alongside the natural danger, a visual grace note that complicates the film's otherwise grim environmental vision. The aurora borealis, with its curtains of green and purple light shimmering across the black sky, suggests that the environment is not merely hostile but also sublime, possessed of an aesthetic dimension that exists independently of its utility or danger to human purposes. This momentary beauty does not mitigate the danger but deepens it, creating a sense of scale in which human struggles are simultaneously desperately urgent and cosmically insignificant. The film's understanding of fatigue as a physical force that degrades performance as surely as mechanical failure is a rare acknowledgement in action cinema of the embodied limitations that real people operating real machinery must constantly manage. The characters grow visibly exhausted as the journey progresses, their reaction times slowing, their decision-making deteriorating, their tempers shortening as the physical and emotional toll of sustained crisis accumulates. This attention to the physiological reality of prolonged stress distinguishes the film from action fantasies, where protagonists maintain peak performance indefinitely, never needing sleep, never making errors, never reaching the limits of their endurance. The sequence in which Mike must crawl beneath a partially submerged truck to perform a repair that cannot be postponed, with freezing water rising around him and the ice continuing to crack overhead, represents the film's most effective fusion of mechanical problem-solving and physical courage. The repair itself is not spectacular, a seized bearing, a frozen coupling, a component that requires only a wrench and the willingness to work in conditions that no sane person would accept. The tension comes not from the complexity of the task, but from the environment in which it must be performed, the literal countdown to hypothermia that begins the moment Mike's body enters the water. The film's use of silence as a dramatic tool is most effective in the moments immediately following a major action sequence, when the sudden absence of engine noise, crashing ice, and screaming metal creates an auditory vacuum that the audience's own elevated heart rate rushes to fill. These silences are the film's punctuation marks, the rests that make the surrounding noise legible as music rather than cacophony. In these quiet moments, the characters assess their damage, count their remaining resources, and make the decisions that will determine their survival in the next phase of the journey. The corporate boardroom scenes, while brief, efficiently establish the institutional culture that has produced the disaster without resorting to the caricatured villainy that mars lesser films. The executives are not cackling sociopaths, but comfortable professionals whose primary concern is liability exposure, stock price impact, and regulatory scrutiny. Their evil is the evil of the ordinary, the everyday prioritization of institutional interests over human lives that characterizes corporate behavior in countless real-world disasters. This banality of corporate evil is more chilling than any mustache-twirling villain could be, because it is recognizable from the morning news rather than from comic books. The film's visual effects shortcomings, most apparent in the avalanche sequence where the snow moves with the weightless fluidity of computer-generated particles rather than the crushing mass of real snow, create a breach in the film's otherwise carefully maintained verisimilitude that is jarring precisely because the surrounding material is effective. This inconsistency may paradoxically serve the film's overall impact by reminding the audience of the practical achievements that surround the digital failures, the real trucks, real cold, real danger that the computer-generated imagery is attempting and failing to extend. The film's score by Max Ehrage employs a palette of low brass, processed percussion, and electronic drones that creates a sonic environment of industrial menace appropriate to the subject matter. The absence of a traditional orchestral theme, a hummable melody that would signal heroism and triumph, is a deliberate choice that keeps the emotional register in a minor key, never allowing the audience the comfort of a musical assurance that everything will work out. The score functions as texture rather than melody, atmosphere rather than theme, a sonic equivalent of the film's visual austerity. The relationship between the film's physical production and its digital post-production reflects the current state of mid-budget action cinema, where practical stunts and location shooting provide the foundation of authenticity, while digital extensions and enhancements attempt to amplify that authenticity into spectacle. The tension between these two modes of filmmaking is visible in The Ice Road, not always to the film's advantage, but the attempt to balance practical and digital elements represents an honest engagement with the resources available rather than a lazy default to computer-generated shortcuts. The film's depiction of the Canadian legal and regulatory framework that governs mining operations, while simplified for dramatic purposes, accurately captures the jurisdictional complexity of an industry regulated by both provincial and federal authorities with overlapping and sometimes conflicting mandates. The mine's ability to operate with disabled safety equipment implies regulatory capture, the process by which industries come to control the agencies that are supposed to oversee them, a phenomenon well documented in Canadian resource extraction history and relevant to understanding how disasters like the one depicted can occur despite the existence of extensive safety regulations on paper. The film's final confrontation between Mike and the corporate forces arrayed against him resolves not through a single decisive action, but through a series of smaller victories, each of which buys enough time for the next to become possible. This incremental approach to climax, a staircase of escalating confrontations rather than a single peak, reflects the film's broader commitment to process over spectacle, showing how problems are actually solved rather than simply announcing their solutions. The rescue of the miners is not a single moment of triumph, but the accumulated result of hundreds of small decisions made correctly under pressure. The film's treatment of Gertie's mechanical intuition, his ability to diagnose engine problems by sound and feel rather than by systematic inspection, gestures toward a theory of intelligence that challenges the narrow definitions employed by educational and professional institutions that have labeled him disabled. His mind works in ways that standardized tests cannot measure and conventional workplaces cannot accommodate, but that are nonetheless profoundly valuable in the specific context of keeping heavy machinery operational in extreme conditions. The film suggests, without quite stating, that the problem is not Gertie's cognitive difference, but a society that has organized itself around a single mode of intelligence and pathologized all others. The film's epilogue, showing Tantu as the inheritor of Goldenrod's mechanical legacy, completes a character arc that has moved her from apprentice to master, from someone who was learning the trade to someone who now embodies it. Her presence in the garage, comfortable among the tools and lifts and the particular smells of diesel and grease that characterize such spaces, suggests a future in which the knowledge that Goldenrod carried, and that he was in the process of transmitting when the mission interrupted his teaching, will continue to be passed forward. This transmission of knowledge across generations and communities is the film's most hopeful note, the suggestion that even in the aftermath of devastating loss, something valuable survives and propagates. The film's final image of Mike's new truck bearing the memorial license plate is a study in the semiotics of working-class grief, a form of mourning that expresses itself not through words or rituals, but through objects of use, things that continue to function in the world and carry the memory of the dead into every mile that remains to be driven. The truck is not a monument that sits still and gathers dust, but a moving memorial, a declaration that Gertie's spirit, his joy in the simple fact of engines running and wheels turning, will continue as long as his brother continues to drive. This is a form of immortality that the film presents without irony or qualification, a genuine belief that the dead survive in the work that the living continue to do in their name. The end,